Hey everyone, Wayne Fox here. Happy New Year. Welcome to 2021. I decided to be a little adventurous and decided I've never grown a beard in my life, and maybe celebrating getting out of 2020, I'd try a new look. A little shaggy right now. I think my beard trimmer shows up tomorrow. We'll see if I can learn to keep it trimmed up and make it look decent. By the next video, it might be gone. We'll see. Anyway, just something new to try. This video, I thought I'd just kind of update what I've found about my new M1 MacBook Pro and my M1 Mac Mini. Too many M's in that. I've had them about a month now. I thought I'd just give a quick update why I thought I'd try them. And then, of course, I've been running Photoshop tests and Lightroom tests on several Macs, MacBook Pros, everything since the 2015 version, a couple of Mac Pros, the 2013, the 2019. I'll link some videos up here in the corner that just kind of go over those tests. What I'm going to do is run the same set of tests on both of these machines just to see how they stack up. Now, granted, they're going to be running an emulation mode, and I'm assuming that once the native version comes out, we'll see some nice performance gains, and I'll rerun the same test once the native versions of Lightroom and Photoshop are available, just to see if it really does help and what the differences are. But the reason I decided to do it in 2018 is when I decided to go to one computer. I bought a 2018 MacBook Pro. I quit using my Mac Pro, and I was pretty happy with that until about a year ago when I decided I would go ahead and buy another Mac Pro, get the 12-core one because it's pretty good with video stuff. And so now I was back to two computers. But I decided that I didn't need as much horsepower when I was traveling. It was more about small, light, battery life, all of those kind of things. And I thought, well, I hope I don't give up too much, because in emulation mode, it might just be sluggish or not responsive and drive me nuts. Now, I shoot with fairly big file cameras, 150 megapixel phase one, 100 megapixel Fuji. I have an A7R4. And sometimes those big files can be pretty sluggish even on my Mac Pro. But I thought I'd give it a try. So what I've got in the video is I've run the same tests, and I'm going to show a comparison of these two in those 6 tests using emulation mode, or Rosetta 2 as they call it, against the 2013 Mac Pro, the 2019 Mac Pro and the 16-inch 2019 MacBook Pro. So we'll compare those 4 machines. And then when I'm done, I'm going to actually load up Lightroom and try to do several tasks, including some spot removal, things like that, and try to do it just side by side so you can kind of see if one has a problem or the other. Now, surprisingly, I'll be a hint, the MacBook Pro is beating my Mac Pro in a couple of areas when I did that, and I was really surprised. Anyway, let's get into the test that I came up with and the results first. First, let's just show the machines that were tested. I'm just going to put them on the screen, and if you want to pause it so you can study it more in detail. The only thing to note here is that the 2019 Mac Pro was a 12-core processor, where the others are all 8-core processors. And as I've shown in my other videos, Lightroom in many tasks is very core dependent and utilizes the cores extremely well. So by adding cores, you definitely can have an impact on its performance. Here again was the entire setup. If you want to read it in detail, go ahead and pause the video and go through it. This is the same thing I've been doing for 4 or 5 videos now. I think the only thing of note here was that on the M1 Macs, I was using Lightroom Classic 10.1, and on the other 2 Macs, I was using Lightroom Classic 9, either 0.1 or 0.2. And there probably was a little bit of performance gains in the upgrade to Lightroom Classic 10.1. I don't think it was significant enough to alter the test dramatically, but I have really no way to know that. So let's get on to the test. The first test was to import 500 Sony A7R4 files. These are pretty good sized files. We have the preview set to be sidecar and embedded. This is the fastest way to get the files off your card into your computer. The files are on an external Thunderbolt 3 SSD, which is quite fast, but they are being copied to the internal SSD, so I'm sort of mimicking an import while you're traveling. If we look at the results, you'll see that all 4 machines did this in fairly efficient fashion, the longest being 1 minute and 31 seconds for the new M1 MacBook Pro, and was only 2 seconds longer than the 2019 Mac Pro. The surprise here to me was that the M1 Mac Mini did it in 1 minute, so it's about 30% faster. I have no way to explain that. I actually was surprised enough I did the test again, and it gave me the same result. So there's something about the Mac Mini and its maybe the way it transfers speed through the SSD. I don't know. I don't know why it was faster. All 4 performed quite well though. Let's get on to test 2. In test 2, we make one-to-one previews of all of those files. And here you can see the 12-core Mac Pro definitely has an advantage. The extra 4 cores and the faster clock speed means it did it in half the time. The new M1 MacBook Pro is a little bit longer than my 16-inch MacBook Pro, but I don't think it's enough that I'm too worried about it. The Mac Mini was a little bit better. I'm assuming that once I get a native version, this will actually be better because we are creating previews using Rosetta 2. I'll be interested to test that when the native versions come out. In test 3, we export all of those files, but we make no modifications to them. So all we're doing is we're setting them to a JPEG 60 and resizing them to 4,000 pixels on the long side. Here again, the 12-core Mac Pro has a big advantage, but you'll see the other machines are all basically neck and neck. There's really no real difference. It surprised me a little bit that the new M1 Macs could do this in the same amount of time. In test 4, we also do the export of all 500 files, but this time we've applied some global changes. We've done 10 dust spots. We've done 2 graduated filters. And what I did is I made an XMP sidecar file back in my very first test, and I import that sidecar file to the first file and then sync it to all 500 files. So in all the tests I do this, the files are all identical and have the same changes. Again, we do a JPEG 60 at 4,000 pixels on the long side. And surprisingly enough on this one, the M1 MacBook Pros outperform the 16-inch MacBook Pro. And the Mac Mini is actually quite a bit faster than the 16-inch MacBook Pro. Again, the 12 cores of the Mac Pro really shine on this, and I think that a new M1 Mac, M1X, which has more cores, will definitely be able to take advantage of these functions in Lightroom once the native version is released. In test 5, we put it to a little bit more traditional test, and what we do is we create 5 panoramas in batch mode. The files are from a Phase 1 IQ180, so they're pretty large files, 80 megapixel. And each panorama has between 6 and 12 shots involved. And here's where the M1 Macs struggle quite a bit. You can see the Mac Pro and the 16-inch MacBook Pro made no real difference, and I'm assuming it's because this is using some probably legacy software coding that came out of Photoshop. And we all know that Photoshop is very poor at core utilization. Now, maybe there's something about this process that can't utilize cores. But when I watch the core utilization on this particular test, we're only getting about 30% efficiency out of the CPU. And the M1 MacBook Pro took 2.5 times longer. Now, I will say that this is 5 panels in a batch mode, which is something I actually never do. And so if you break it down into individual panels, perhaps a 6 or 7 shot panel would take a minute on the MacBook Pro 16-inch. It might take a couple minutes on the new M1 MacBook Pro. So I'm not too worried about this for right now. It's not like I'm doing hundreds of panoramas. If you're a shooter that actually does just tons and tons of panoramas and you're stitching them all the time, obviously it might affect you. Now again, it'll be interesting to see once we get a native version how that works. And the final test is to run Puget Systems 2019 Photoshop benchmark test. This is the best test I've found to really get a feel for Photoshop. The downside of this test is it runs a series of around 21 different functions, and then it repeats it 2 other times, but you can't isolate and eliminate those from the test. The problem I had is I wanted to run the new native version, that Photoshop beta that they have out, but content-aware fill doesn't work, and this, of course, is a function I use in Photoshop more than any other. So I'm going to try to see if there's a relevance, because what I think might be happening is there's a panel merge involved in this, and it occurs 3 times throughout the test, and it could be the bulk of the speed difference we're seeing here is because of the panel merge. If you see here, the M1 MacBook Pro took about 25% longer than the Intel Macs. Interesting, the MacBook Pro and the 2019 Mac Pro are pretty much identical. Just goes to show you how poorly Photoshop manages cores, because giving it more cores and even higher clock speed just doesn't help at all. There's a lot of legacy code in Photoshop, unfortunately, which is slowing it down. And I don't know if Adobe really has priorities set to try to speed that up. Mac Mini did a little bit better. I thought I would throw this up real quick. This shows the last 4 MacBook Pros that Apple has made. These are all pretty much top of the line units. And you can compare the red bar, which is the new one, to the other bars. You'll see in almost all the functions in Lightroom, the new MacBook Pro is actually faster or as fast. You really don't lose anything. If you have one of these machines, it kind of gives you an idea where you stand. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is load up Lightroom on each machine on my 4K display. I'm going to try to do the same things and then kind of piece it together so you can see them happening simultaneously. To give you an idea of how long it takes to scroll through the grid view, I'm going to go and go from picture to picture to picture to see how long it takes to pop into, it's a little bit of a delay. I'm going to draw some stuff on a couple of images, put a bunch of dust spots on. When you start doing dust spotting, both computers are laggy. The one that's really surprised me is, I've got a 7-stitch panel that when you drag on my Mac Pro is like really laggy, and the MacBook Pro is really not laggy at all. So let me just show you how I came up with those. They're not going to be timed perfectly together. I'm not doing the exact same things. I'm just trying to duplicate the concept, and then I'm timing them so at least they'll give you an idea. So I'm going to put the two screens up side by side. The left side is my new M1 MacBook Pro driving my 4K BenQ monitor. And on the right side is my Mac Pro driving the same monitor. The two Lightroom libraries I'm using are identical to each other. And basically I'm just going to try different tasks, and I'm just going to show them side by side and kind of talk about the differences I feel. Real quickly, in this first clip is showing them both opening. And you'll notice that they're pretty close to the same. There's some slight variations, but in the end, they end up opening in about the same amount of time. In each of these tests, I've actually started Lightroom fresh so that there's nothing in the cache file, so we can really get a good accurate feel of how both respond. In this first test, I'm simply going to scroll through the entire library, dragging the slider as fast as I can so it looks smooth and not too jerky. It was rather difficult on the Mac Pro to do that. It seemed to jump, and I had to go fairly slow as compared to the others. You can see how much faster I could scroll through the MacBook Pro, which surprised me. In this second test, I clicked at the bottom of the screen as fast as I could, allowing the screen to redraw each time just to see how quickly I could go through. And I could click through it much faster on the MacBook Pro. For some reason, it seems to be able to handle the graphics and show the images faster. I didn't bother scrolling all the way through the list, but notice the position of the thumb indicator in the scroll bar, how much further along it is on the MacBook Pro than on the Mac Pro. So here we're going to use the arrow keys to go from the first to the last file as fast as we can, making sure the screen fully redraws each time. Notice again, the MacBook Pro can actually do this considerably fast and faster than the Mac Pro. Now we're going to go back to the first of these files, and we're going to click the middle to zoom into one-to-one. And then as soon as the loading screen moves and the print goes sharp, we're going to hit the arrow key to go to the next one. So at this point, there are no one-to-one previews in the database. They've been deleted to make sure it's even. So we're having to build a one-to-one preview each time we push the arrow key to move to the next file. And you'll notice that both machines are performing pretty similarly. The Mac Pro is actually a little bit faster at this, and we saw that in the original tests where it could make the one-to-one previews in about half the time as the MacBook Pro. So you'd think that it would be faster. This image right here is actually a large panel, so it takes a little longer to make the one-to-one preview. This is the same test. We've quit the database and come back in, but now we have one-to-one previews. And as you can see, you can go much faster if the one-to-one previews are in there. And in fact, the MacBook Pro is considerably faster than the Mac Pro at this point. Here I've reopened the file to this image, and I'm going to click on the image next to it. And then I'm going to click to zoom the image one-to-one. Right now there are no one-to-one previews saved in this database on either computer. And so really what we're comparing is how quickly each one can make a one-to-one preview. One thing to note here is this is a 7-shot panel from a 150 megapixel back. So it's a really, really large image. and it will take quite a bit of time to make the one-to-one preview and then go one-to-one. So I'll probably speed this up in post, but I'll put a little timer next to it so you can see how long it takes. So here you can see the Mac Pro did this about 23 seconds faster than the MacBook Pro. Now I've restarted the database. We're going to repeat the same process. This time there are one-to-one previews, and so we'll see if it makes any difference. Again, I'll probably speed this up because it does take a while, even though the machines have a one-to-one preview. It seems if the MacBook Pro has previews in the cache file, it's much faster than the Mac Pro. If the previews need to be built in emulation mode, the MacBook Pro can't keep up. This here was actually pretty shocking, as it took 50 seconds longer. But the thing I discovered after I researched this is the MacBook Pro's internal SSD is giving me over 10,000 megabytes a second of read speed if I'm reading in files 256 megabytes or smaller. Just incredibly fast read speeds, about double the internal SSD of my Mac Pro. And that might explain this. So now what I'm going to do is click and drag the picture in the middle with just the hand, and I'm just dragging it up and down, and you can see very clearly how the MacBook Pro has much smoother scrolling when I do this. I was actually surprised by this, and you can see how long it took to catch up. And now we're going to go into the preview window. I'm going to click into each corner. You can see how quickly that it moves. Watch the box move as it moves slowly. And now I'm going to click in the middle of the preview window and start dragging around. And this is where it really shows up. As I drag the Mac Pro, it's really, really, really laggy, terrible. MacBook Pro is just like instant with no problem. Now what I'm going to do is use the brush tool and just draw some brushes that are very obvious, certainly not something I would do, but I'm just going to trace out some of these lines. And what I found was that there was really no lagginess on the brush with either image. I could go pretty quickly. I added several new brushes, so I was basically creating several layers of brushes. And I didn't have any trouble drawing pretty much as quickly as I wanted to. It never lagged, it never fell behind on either machine. So pretty much the same performance. So now I'm just going to use the dust spot tool, and just click a few things. I'm going to drag it a couple of times. And it's hard to see this on the screen, but I felt that they were very, very similar. They're both a little laggy. And this is typical if you're working on an image which has quite a few other local adjustments, especially brush tools, and then you start doing your dust spotting. Better do your dust spotting first, or there's a tip I have if you've already done a bunch of adjustments, how you can do the dust spots so they're not laggy and then apply them. And then also in a second here, you'll see that I'm going to drag the spot tool across the top of the window through the sky. And it's pretty laggy as it moves back and forth on both machines. I didn't think it was any real different. They both seem to be about the same amount of lag. Definitely not as smooth as you would hope. Well, that's about a wrap. I maybe want to sum up a few things. First of all, let me talk about a couple of the maybe negatives. I've heard you can't use two external displays with this. I had no trouble using the MacBook Pro display along with my BenQ 4K 32-inch display at the same time. Now, I've also heard that there's a way to hack around that. There's a few videos about that out there. So if you want to run two displays, one of the challenges is the other thing that it only has two Thunderbolt 4 ports or Thunderbolt 3 USB 4 ports. And so that's a little bit of a problem. Obviously, there's quite a few good hubs and dongles. But if you need more Thunderbolt 4 ports or Thunderbolt 3, it's weird because they call the cable Thunderbolt 4, yet the ports are still Thunderbolt 3. There's a new dock by OWC, which connects to your computer, charges at the same time, and adds 3 Thunderbolt ports in that device. So you still have 1 on your computer, now 3 on the dock. Dock also has a USB 3.2 Type A slot in it, so it's kind of small and compact. So if you've got a lot of Thunderbolt 3 devices that you need to plug in. But as far as the computer itself, maybe a couple of negatives, but overall I'm pretty happy with it. It's really light, it runs very cool. It's fast, as you can see from the test. I'm guessing once the native versions are out, it might be even faster than my Mac Pro. And battery lasts just forever. I mean, I can sit and work for hours with Lightroom. If I'm watching videos or something, I'm guessing it'll go, who knows, 8, 10, 12 hours. So pretty cool. It'll be a great traveling computer. And I'm surprised that it might even replace the Mac Pro. Now, I haven't done a lot of video work with it, but I have seen a couple people say that it does. Now, the only rumors I would say, maybe you want to wait, because there's some pretty strong rumors now that Apple's got a 14-inch and a 16-inch completely redesigned chassis MacBook Pro coming this year. It'll be more square. The display portion will be thinner, and that will allow them to add a few things that they've removed over the years to make up for this kind of design they have. There's talk of an SD card slot being back in it. There's talk of possibly a USB type A slot in it. Obviously, there'll be probably 4 Thunderbolt ports / USB-C ports. It's rumored to have a new type of magnetic charging adapter so that you won't actually plug anything in, kind of like the old MagSafe was, but probably something more like what happens when you set your iPad onto this stand they make. If the stand's plugged in, that'll charge your iPad. Pretty cool. Display's supposed to be mini LED, which is really cool, and sounds like it might supplant OLED as probably the premier way to do a display. So it might be worth waiting for. The other rumor is it'll have the M1X processor or an M2 processor, which will have more cores, and especially GPU cores. There's even rumors of 16 or 32 cores in the GPU portion. So at that point, it'll probably be faster than a current $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 Mac Pro. So it might be worth the wait. My guess is they'll announce it in June, and it'll ship sometime next fall. Hard to say, though. Apple's been kind of surprising everybody lately, but the rumors are coming from multiple sources and pretty reliable. If you like that kind of stuff, lots of YouTube channels. I shouldn't watch that stuff, I know. Anyway, I'm pretty happy with the decision. I'm excited to take a trip as soon as things kind of clear up here in the future and give it a whirl. Right now, I can sit and use it in my lap for Lightroom for hours, so that's pretty nice. Appreciate you watching the video. Hope you found it was informational and somewhat entertaining. I'm not, a real comedian or anything. But if you like my videos, make sure you subscribe to the channel down there. Maybe hit the bell so you get notified. And maybe throw me a like if you wouldn't mind. YouTube algorithms are kind of flaky, and it'll help me get a few more views if you do. Anyway, my next video I've got just about done is how to use i1 Profiler and i1 Pro, Display Pro to calibrate and profile your display. It's kind of follow-up of my color management series, how to get your display to really be a good predictor of what your prints are going to look like. If you're a photographer, make sure you tune into that. In the meantime, hey, thanks for watching. Have a great new year. See ya.